There are people who walk into a room and change its atmosphere without saying a word. People whose presence lingers like a melody you can't forget. This is the story of one such man. He doesn't command attention with noise, but with silence that speaks louder than words. In a world obsessed with appearances, he lives by something deeper, an invisible force that draws others in and unsettles them at the same time. What is it about him that makes strangers confess, that calms storms, yet never quite belongs? This journey reveals the 10 signs of a soul with an unshakable aura. In a world saturated with noise and distraction, there are rare individuals who move differently, quietly, powerfully, and with a depth that can't be explained. They do not seek attention, but attention finds them. This is the story of one such man, an enigma wrapped in silence, whose presence alone shifts the emotional temperature of every room he enters. He isn't trying to be seen. He simply is, and that is enough to unsettle some and comfort others. This story unravels through 10 profound signs that reveal what it truly means to possess an unshakable aura. Each moment captures how this man navigates the world, not through dominance, but through depth, not through performance, but through presence. Strangers open up to him as if guided by an unseen truth. He brings calm in chaos, not with words, but with the weight of his stillness. His eyes hold a gaze too intense for the superficial, and his silence speaks volumes, echoing deeper truths. In environments driven by masks and shallow pleasantries, he doesn't fit and never tries to. Yet his absence is felt as deeply as his presence. People project their own insecurities onto him, seeing reflections of what they fear or long to become. But he remains grounded. His strength was forged in the fires of quiet suffering. He lives not to impress, but to express something real, something raw. His path is one of authenticity, of choosing soul over spectacle, of knowing that worth doesn't beg for recognition. This isn't just a story. It's an emotional journey into what it means to be truly powerful without ever needing to prove it. Dive into these 10 quietly powerful truths, and you might just recognize someone you know or someone you are becoming. It wasn't just that he noticed everything, it was how he responded to it. While others were swept into storms of noise, drama, and ego-driven conflict, he remained still. There was a strange serenity to him, as if he walked through life untouched by the turbulence around him, not because he was indifferent, but because he had already faced his own inner chaos and learned not to be shaken by the outer world. People would often find themselves calming down in his presence without knowing why. Rooms heavy with tension seemed to exhale when he entered. Conversation shifted, voices softened, and the pace slowed. His energy demanded no control, but somehow created it. And in moments when everything felt like it was falling apart, his silence became a kind of unspoken anchor, something to hold on to. He wasn't one to rush into fixing things. Instead, he listened deeply. He didn't offer cliches or solutions for the sake of comfort. He allowed people to unravel without judgment, to be messy, afraid, or lost. And in that space, something powerful happened. People began to feel safe, safe to feel, safe to be real. This calming energy wasn't something he manufactured. It came from surviving his own storms, from sitting with pain instead of escaping it, from learning how to breathe through grief, disappointment, and confusion. That inner stability radiated outward, creating a kind of sanctuary wherever he went. He didn't need to be the loudest in the room to lead. His presence alone was enough to restore order, not by force, but by frequency. In a world addicted to chaos, he became the rare reminder that true power is quiet, that strength is steady, and that sometimes the most impactful thing a person can do is simply be still. The calm he carried wasn't always welcomed. For many, it was a mirror, and not everyone is ready to look into something that reflects back what they've been avoiding. His silence, his steady gaze, his refusal to engage in surface-level drama, it all stirred something deeper in others. And that's where the danger of projection began. People often saw in him what they couldn't face in themselves. Their insecurities, fears, and unresolved pain were unknowingly placed on his shoulders. To some, his peace looked like arrogance. To others, his stillness felt like judgment. Without saying a word, he became the canvas for their shadows. They didn't understand him, so they misunderstood him, and in their discomfort, they turned him into a villain in stories he never agreed to play a role in. But he saw it. He recognized it for what it was, pain, displaced and disguised. He had done the same in his past before he learned better. So he didn't fight their projections. He didn't defend himself. Instead, he let the accusations fall like rain on stone. His self-worth was no longer tied to how others perceived him. That freedom was hard-won, earned through years of inner excavation and heartbreak. Still, it wasn't easy. Being the mirror meant walking alone. It meant being misunderstood, even resented, simply for existing as himself. But he knew the difference between carrying truth and carrying someone else's wounds, and he refused to internalize what was never his to hold. In the quiet of his presence, people were forced to confront themselves, and while some grew because of it, others recoiled. That was the cost of being real in a world full of masks. But he accepted it, because he would rather be rejected for his authenticity than loved for a version of himself that wasn't true. When people project their pain onto someone who doesn't mirror their dysfunction, fantasy often fills the gaps reality cannot explain. In his case, others didn't just misunderstand him. They invented stories to make sense of the way he moved through life untouched by their chaos. They built entire narratives around his presence, assigning him roles and dreams he never subscribed to. In their eyes, he was the healer, the savior, the mystery, or sometimes even the antagonist. But none of those stories were truly about him. They were about what others wished he could be for them. This created a quiet kind of suffering, not from conflict, but from confusion. People approached him not for who he was, but for who they imagined he could become in their world. They didn't fall in love with him. They fell in love with an idea of him, and when reality failed to match their illusion, they didn't grieve the fantasy. They blamed the man. He watched as admiration turned to resentment, connection twisted into distortion. They wanted his depth, but not the shadows that came with it. They sought comfort in his silence, only to later call it coldness, when it refused to echo their noise. His strength, once admired, became threatening. His independence, once magnetic, became abandonment in their eyes. It was a strange kind of loneliness to be surrounded by people who claimed to know him, yet never truly saw him. To be needed, but never fully accepted. He wasn't bitter, just quiet. He learned to recognize the ache in others, the longing to be saved, to be seen, and the danger that came when they confused him with their own salvation. He could hold space for their pain, but he couldn't carry their fantasies. That was never his role, and never would be. Following the trail of misunderstood connection and relational suffering, he began to notice a deeper, more archetypal pattern, a silent dance between his presence and the inner worlds of the women he encountered. It wasn't just about unmet expectations or romantic illusions. It was about the animus, the unconscious masculine within the female psyche, projected outward onto him with startling intensity. For many women, he unknowingly became the embodiment of their ideal inner man. Strong, yet gentle, mysterious, yet safe, powerful, yet kind. In his eyes, they saw something ancient and familiar, as if he awakened a myth they had long forgotten but deeply yearned for. But this projection, like all fantasies, came with shadows. They weren't relating to him. They were relating to the image their soul had constructed long before he arrived. And when he didn't live up to the godlike qualities they attributed to him, when he showed vulnerability, boundaries, or even silence, the illusion fractured, and with it, their sense of self. Some withdrew, some lashed out, some mourned a man who never truly existed. To him, it was a spiritual burden. He wasn't interested in being idolized. He wanted truth, not projection. But the more aligned he became with his essence, the more he seemed to mirror their deepest longings, often without saying a word. And that, too, was part of the paradox. The more authentic he became, the more people saw what they needed, not who he was. He carried this quietly, with the grace of someone who understood the archetypal forces at play. He knew that animus wasn't his to fulfill or fix. It belonged to them. It was their journey to integrate, not his to complete. And so once again, he stood at the threshold of others' dreams, close enough to be touched, yet never truly reached. As he continued to walk the quiet path between truth and illusion, the divide between instinct and consciousness grew more visible. The projections cast upon him, especially by women navigating their animus, were often rooted not in deliberate malice, but in primal instinct. These impulses rose from the depths, bypassing reason, bypassing logic, and anchoring themselves in ancient longing. He became less of a man and more of a symbol, triggering something wordless, old and buried. He began to see how much of human interaction was driven by instinctual hunger, by a need to merge, to belong, to be saved, to possess. These were not inherently wrong, but they were unconscious, and in the absence of awareness, instinct can become a blind force, devouring what it seeks to cherish. He saw people act not from their higher selves, but from ancient scripts written in the bones, scripts that confused connection with consumption, love with longing, safety with control. He too had his instincts, the urge to disappear when misunderstood, the impulse to protect himself from emotional volatility. But where others collapsed into fantasy, he tried to rise into clarity, not above them, but inward, deeper. He did not demonize instinct. Instead, he sought to integrate it with consciousness, to hold his animal self with the same care as his spirit. And that is what made him different. He didn't reject desire, nor did he worship it. He questioned it, sat with it, asked what it wanted, and whether it was rooted in love or fear. Most didn't. The more he lived from this integrated state, the more dissonance he encountered. Instinct called others toward him, but his consciousness startled them. They expected a myth, but met a mirror, one that showed not what they wanted, but what they needed to awaken within themselves. And many weren't ready. Illusion was a recurring guest in his life, soft-spoken, seductive, and almost always arriving in the form of another's expectation. People didn't fall for him. They fell for the idea of him, a savior, a soulmate, a shadow of some unfulfilled dream. He learned this not with bitterness, but with a kind of soul-worn sorrow. As instinct met the weight of his consciousness, as fantasy collided with his grounded presence, the illusion could no longer hold its shape. And when illusions fall, they rarely go quietly. Disillusionment for many felt like betrayal. But he hadn't lied. He hadn't promised to be what they imagined. He had only stood there, present, reflective, real. And yet, the unraveling of their fantasies triggered a storm. He became the villain, not for what he did, but for what he couldn't become in their stories. It was as if his refusal to perform the illusion was an offense in itself. He watched it happen again and again. The initial fascination, the pedestal, the subtle possession wrapped in admiration, then the inevitable fall, as his presence revealed the gap between projection and truth. Some responded with quiet disappointment, others with rage, but the pain was not truly about him. It was about the shattering of a mirror made of longing. Still, he held space for it. He understood that disillusionment, though painful, was sacred. It was the moment the dream breaks so the soul can wake. He did not want to be worshipped. He wanted to be seen, and he knew that anyone who could walk through the fire of their disillusionment without blame was someone who might finally meet him, heart to heart, not fantasy to fantasy. But those people were rare. Most loved the illusion more than the truth. And so he walked on. Illusion was a recurring guest in his life, soft-spoken, seductive, and almost always arriving in the form of another's expectation. People didn't fall for him. They fell for the idea of him. A savior, a soulmate, a shadow of some unfulfilled dream. He learned this not with bitterness, but with a kind of soul-worn sorrow. As instinct met the weight of his consciousness, as fantasy collided with his grounded presence, the illusion could no longer hold its shape. And when illusions fall, they rarely go quietly. Disillusionment for many felt like betrayal. But he hadn't lied. He hadn't promised to be what they imagined. He had only stood there, present, reflective, real. And yet, the unraveling of their fantasies triggered a storm. He became the villain, not for what he did, but for what he couldn't become in their stories. It was as if his refusal to perform the illusion was an offense in itself. He watched it happen again and again, the initial fascination, the pedestal, the subtle possession wrapped in admiration, then the inevitable fall, as his presence revealed the gap between projection and truth. Some responded with quiet disappointment, others with rage. But the pain was not truly about him, it was about the shattering of a mirror made of longing. Still, he held space for it. He understood that disillusionment, though painful, was sacred. It was the moment the dream breaks so the soul can wake. He did not want to be worshipped. He wanted to be seen. And he knew that anyone who could walk through the fire of their disillusionment without blame was someone who might finally meet him, heart to heart, not fantasy to fantasy. But those people were rare. Most loved the illusion more than the truth. And so he walked on. Just as he was burdened by projections, he began to see their reflection in others, especially in women shaped by inner wounds and ancestral stories. In the silence after disillusionment, he saw a deeper layer, the feminine projection of the animus, the inner masculine, cast upon him like a cloak he never asked to wear. These projections were not conscious. They were born of longing, unmet protection, absent fathers, or romantic myths that had fermented in solitude. To many, he was not merely a man, but an archetype, half god, half wound healer. He stood tall, with presence and depth, and in doing so became a screen onto which dreams were cast. He will understand me when no one else has. He will rescue me from my pain. He will complete me. These were not voices he heard aloud, but energies he felt like ripples in a still pond. But what happens when the god refuses the crown? When the projection finds no foothold? The woman, like the man before her, suffers the collapse of her fantasy. Some withdrew, heartbroken. Others reacted with blame or betrayal. Yet the pain beneath was more ancient, a grief tied not to him, but to every moment the masculine had failed to be what was imagined or hoped for. He began to understand that the illusion was never just romantic. It was spiritual. These women weren't falling for him, but for the idea of healing through him. And when he couldn't be that, they often felt abandoned, even though he had never offered rescue. In this mirror, he saw his own lessons reflected back. He, too, had once chased the illusion of a healing other. Now, standing in truth, he bore the cost of refusing to play the fantasy. And through it, something fierce and tender awoke in him, compassion. In the quiet aftermath of disillusionment, he started to realize that the purest form of projection was often disguised as love. It wasn't just about the need for rescue or salvation. It was about the intense, consuming belief that this person could fulfill the deep, unspoken needs carried from childhood and from generations before. In relationships, love wasn't just love. It was the unconscious hope that the other could complete something within that had long been broken or absent. And yet, love in this form was always a mirror, distorting as much as it reflected. The women who had projected their fantasies onto him were not all simply searching for a savior. They were searching for an answer to an existential question. Who am I if I am not whole? The idea of love, in its idealized form, became the canvas onto which they painted their deepest fears and desires. The belief that love would cure the wounds they carried, emotional scars from absent fathers, painful relationships, or deep societal expectations, drove them to seek completion in another. But when love itself was entwined with projections, it was no longer a force of connection, but a silent battlefield of unspoken demands. In this recognition, he felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility. Love, as he now saw it, was too often a projection of needs, not a pure meeting of two souls. Each glance, each word, each touch was laden with unconscious expectations. When the object of love, the projection, refused to perform its role, love turned bitter and resentful. What once felt like affection became a pressure, a burden. He began to see that love could never be whole if it was built on projections. For love to be real, it had to be freed from the cage of fantasy and illusion. It had to be seen for what it was. Two beings choosing to meet each other with full awareness, free of the need for rescue, free of the weight of invisible expectations. Only then could love breathe its truest, most expansive form, unshackled by the illusions that had once bound them both. After the heavy veil of projection lifted, he began to understand what real intimacy could look like. An intimacy not forged in fantasy, but built in the shared space between two authentic beings. The realization came slowly, like the delicate unfurling of a bud in the morning sun. True intimacy wasn't about fulfilling the other's fantasies or meeting invisible demands. It was about daring to show up as you truly were, without the protective armor of expectation or illusion. Real intimacy began in the quiet acceptance of imperfection. It meant embracing vulnerability, not as a tool for manipulation or a request for rescue, but as a raw offering of the self. There was a subtle power in allowing the other person to see both the light and the shadow within you, knowing that their love and connection would not depend on the perfection of what was revealed, but on the depth of understanding and compassion between both souls. It was about being seen, not through the lens of fantasy, but as you truly were, with all your flaws, your fears, and your beauty. In this new space, love transformed. It no longer felt like an external force dictating how one should feel or act. Instead, it became a shared experience of presence, each person deeply rooted in themselves and yet open to the connection with the other. There was no longer a sense of needing to be fixed or completed by the other. Instead, each person was responsible for their own healing, bringing to the relationship not a desperate need for validation, but a willingness to meet the other with open hands, offering themselves as they were, whole and unbroken. True intimacy was found in this shared vulnerability, in the absence of projections. It was a path of mutual growth, where each person could be free to be themselves without the weight of the other's unspoken needs. And in that freedom, intimacy could flourish, real, authentic, and profoundly transformative.